Victor Reinhardt had learned long ago that timing was everything. 1 second too soon, one misstep, and the mission could unravel. As he moved through the enemy stronghold, he felt the weight of the world pressing on him, not as an abstract burden, but as the tangible presence of men, women, and children whose fates rested on his actions. He had trained for decades for moments like this, but nothing in his past could fully prepare him for the intensity of what he faced now. The corridors stretched endlessly, each corner a potential ambush, each shadow a possible death. Yet Victor advanced with quiet determination, guided not by instinct alone, but by a meticulous understanding of human behavior. He knew how the enemy thought, how they operated, and how their overconfidence could be turned against them. Every guard he passed, every door he bypassed, was a calculated step in a dance where one misstep would be fatal. Finally, he reached the inner chamber, the nerve center of enemy operations. Inside, stacks of documents, coded messages, and maps detailed strategies that, if executed, would devastate Allied forces the following day. Victor's heart pounded as he scanned the room, but he allowed no hesitation. Every second counted. He swiftly located the critical intelligence, memorizing details, photographing key documents, and preparing to transmit them to his superiors. As he worked, the tension mounted. Footsteps approached, voices echoed, and the threat of discovery was imminent. Victor relied on years of training in stealth, remaining motionless when necessary, blending into the environment as if he were part of the shadows themselves. Each decision required precision. Hesitate, and the mission could fail. Act too quickly, and he could be exposed. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and finally Victor completed the extraction. Every code, every map, every confidential report was now in his possession. But the mission was far from over. He had to escape, deliver the intelligence, and ensure that it reached Allied command within the critical 24-hour window. Failure was not an option. As he worked, the tension mounted. Footsteps approached, voices echoed, and the threat of discovery was imminent. Victor relied on years of training in stealth, remaining motionless when necessary, blending into the environment as if he were part of the shadows themselves. Each decision required precision. Hesitate, and the mission could fail. Act too quickly, and he could be exposed. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and finally, Victor completed the extraction. Every code, every map, every confidential report was now in his possession. But the mission was far from over. He had to escape, deliver the intelligence, and ensure that it reached Allied command within the critical 24-hour window. Failure was not an option. The return journey was perilous. Patrols moved with a heightened sense of suspicion. Obstacles appeared where none existed before, and the environment itself seemed determined to impede him. Victor navigated alleys, rooftops, and underground passages, relying on his intimate knowledge of urban landscapes and enemy routines. Each step was a negotiation with danger. Each breath a measured act of survival. As dawn approached, Victor finally transmitted the intelligence to Allied command. Officers in distant locations received the information and immediately began reorganizing forces, repositioning troops, and preparing for a counterstrike. The enemy, unaware that their plans had been compromised, advanced confidently, only to be met with unexpected resistance. Within 24 hours, the tide of the war shifted. Strategic positions previously thought impenetrable were overtaken, ambushes were executed with precision, and what could have been a catastrophic defeat for the Allies became a decisive victory. The operation, orchestrated by countless soldiers, pilots, and strategists, had been made possible by the actions of a single individual who worked in the shadows.
Victor Reinhardt disappeared into obscurity after the mission, his role known to only a handful of people. The world would celebrate generals and leaders. Yet the man who had changed the course of history in a single day remained a ghost. And perhaps that was how it should be. For history is often shaped not by those in the spotlight, but by those who move unseen, guided by courage, skill, and an unwavering sense of duty. The sun had barely risen when the first reports reached Allied headquarters. At first, the officers hesitated, unsure whether the intelligence was accurate or a trap. But as more confirmations arrived, sketches, codes, and exact troop movements, they realized that the information was genuine. Every detail Victor had risked his life to obtain was correct, precise, and actionable. Commanders moved swiftly, coordinating forces that had previously been scattered across multiple fronts. Troops were rerouted, supplies redirected, and artillery positioned to strike where the enemy least expected. Air support was called in to complement ground maneuvers, and naval units adjusted their patrols to intercept reinforcements. Every decision hinged on the intelligence Victor had gathered, and every minute wasted could cost thousands of lives.
Victor watched from a distance, unseen and unrecognized, as the consequences of his actions unfolded. Each maneuver executed by the Allied command validated the risks he had taken, confirming that one man, acting with courage and intelligence, could indeed shape the outcome of a conflict that spanned continents. By nightfall, the battlefield had transformed. Positions that had once seemed impregnable were lost. The enemy, disoriented and unprepared, had no choice but to retreat or surrender. Communications across their lines were disrupted, creating confusion and panic. It was not just a tactical victory, it was a psychological one, a demonstration that even the most meticulous plans could be undone by a single decisive action. And yet, for Victor, there was no triumph, no medals, no public recognition, no parades to celebrate his courage. He vanished as quietly as he had arrived, returning to anonymity, to the shadows from which he had emerged. The war would continue, battles would rage, but for 24 hours, history had been rewritten, not by generals or governments, but by the choices of one man who dared to walk where others feared to tread. In the following weeks, Allied forces capitalized on the advantage his intelligence had provided. Strategic victories accumulated, and campaigns that might have resulted in disaster were redirected toward success. Planners and strategists, working with the knowledge Victor had risked everything to obtain, adjusted operations with remarkable speed. The enemy struggled to understand how their plans had been so thoroughly anticipated. Their movements countered at every turn. In secret briefings, commanders referred to the intelligence as miraculous. Some suspected that there had been a mole within their own ranks, but none could pinpoint the source. The true architect remained hidden, his name unknown, his identity buried under layers of deception and careful planning. History often remembers the generals who give orders and the soldiers who follow them. Yet, in this instance, it was the invisible hand, the unseen mind that altered the course of events. Victor Reinhardt had demonstrated that courage and intellect, when combined, could defy probability and redefine the boundaries of what one person could achieve. But Victor's mission had not been without peril. Even as the Allied forces acted on his intelligence, he remained deep within enemy territory, every step a test of endurance and cunning. The enemy, though unaware of the betrayal that had struck at the heart of their plans, still maintained rigorous patrols. Soldiers moved with disciplined precision, their eyes scanning streets, rooftops, and alleys, searching for any sign of intrusion.
Victor navigated this dangerous landscape with careful calculation. He understood patterns, when guards shifted, when patrols doubled back, and when shadows could conceal him. Yet, there were moments when danger pressed close. A sharp whistle in the distance, the click of boots against pavement, the sudden rustle of paper in the wind, all reminded him that exposure could come at any second. It was in one of these moments that he nearly faltered. A group of officers, their attention drawn by a routine inspection, moved directly toward him. Victor froze, blending seamlessly with the darkness, holding his breath as they passed within arm's length. Each heartbeat felt like an eternity. He had been trained for this, yet no training could fully erase the primal fear of being discovered in a place where capture meant death. Once the immediate danger passed, he continued toward the extraction point, a location carefully chosen by his allies, where he could transmit final confirmations and receive instructions for safe exfiltration. Along the way, he relied on every skill he had mastered: silent movement, mental mapping, improvisation, and an acute awareness of human behavior. It was a test not only of physical ability, but of psychological endurance. Meanwhile, the Allied command worked frantically to turn the intelligence into action. Troop movements were synchronized with extraordinary speed. Artillery positions were adjusted to anticipate enemy advances. Air support struck precisely where it was most needed, disrupting supply lines and sowing confusion. The enemy's confidence began to crumble as every plan they had painstakingly constructed unraveled in real time. By midday, the results were undeniable. Positions once believed secure were overrun, communication lines severed, and entire units rendered ineffective. The enemy, still unaware that the decisive advantage had come from a single spy, could only react desperately. Victor navigated this dangerous landscape with careful calculation. He understood patterns, when guards shifted, when patrols doubled back, and when shadows could conceal him. Yet, there were moments when danger pressed close. A sharp whistle in the distance, the click of boots against pavement, the sudden rustle of paper in the wind, all reminded him that exposure could come at any second. It was in one of these moments that he nearly faltered. A group of officers, their attention drawn by a routine inspection, moved directly toward him. Victor froze, blending seamlessly with the darkness, holding his breath as they passed within arm's length. Each heartbeat felt like an eternity. He had been trained for this, yet no training could fully erase the primal fear of being discovered in a place where capture meant death. Once the immediate danger passed, he continued toward the extraction point, a location carefully chosen by his allies, where he could transmit final confirmations and receive instructions for safe exfiltration. Along the way, he relied on every skill he had mastered: silent movement, mental mapping, improvisation, and an acute awareness of human behavior. It was a test not only of physical ability, but of psychological endurance. Meanwhile, the Allied command worked frantically to turn the intelligence into action. Troop movements were synchronized with extraordinary speed. Artillery positions were adjusted to anticipate enemy advances. Air support struck precisely where it was most needed, disrupting supply lines and sowing confusion. The enemy's confidence began to crumble as every plan they had painstakingly constructed unraveled in real time. By midday, the results were undeniable. Positions once believed secure were overrun, communication lines severed, and entire units rendered ineffective. The enemy, still unaware that the decisive advantage had come from a single spy, could only react desperately. Back in the shadows, Victor continued his journey. Though the mission's critical intelligence had been delivered, his task was not yet complete. He had to cross hostile territory to reach extraction points, evade search parties, and ensure that no trace of his presence remained. Every step tested his endurance. Every sound heightened his awareness. And every encounter demanded split-second judgment.
Yet Victor moved with unwavering determination. Failure was not an option. The cost was far too high. As he navigated narrow alleyways and abandoned streets, the weight of the past 24 hours settled over him. He thought not of fame or recognition, but of the lives saved, the battles averted, and the countless futures preserved by the intelligence he carried. Each piece of information he had secured had been a lifeline, a chance to prevent destruction on a scale the world had not yet imagined. Meanwhile, the enemy began to suspect that their plans had been compromised. Investigations were launched, internal inquiries conducted, and security protocols intensified. Officers questioned their own people, suspecting traitors, spies, and infiltrators. Yet despite their efforts, the true source remained elusive. Victor had operated with such precision and cunning that no clue betrayed his presence. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost whose impact could be measured only in outcomes. As the hours passed, Allied forces consolidated their advantage. Every movement, every decision, every counterattack was informed by the intelligence he had provided. Positions that had seemed unbeatable were overtaken, and entire strategies collapsed under the weight of unforeseen opposition. By the end of the second day, the tide had not only turned, it had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. Victor finally reached the extraction point, blending seamlessly into a world that remained unaware of the pivotal role he had played. There were no celebrations, no medals awaiting him, only the quiet satisfaction that the mission had succeeded. He disappeared as quietly as he had entered, leaving behind a battlefield transformed, a war redirected, and a legacy that would remain hidden from history for years to come.
In the aftermath, Allied commanders would study the intelligence and the resulting victories for months. They would marvel at the precision and foresight that had allowed them to anticipate enemy movements so accurately. They would celebrate the strategic decisions made possible by knowledge that had been nearly impossible to acquire. Yet the individual who had made it all possible remained unrecognized, a shadow whose courage had defined a critical turning point in the war. The spy who turned the tide of the war in 24 hours had accomplished something extraordinary. In a world consumed by chaos, destruction, and uncertainty, one man had reminded history that intelligence, courage, and decisive action could outweigh armies and artillery. He had altered the course of events not with sheer force, but with intellect, skill, and the unyielding resolve to act when it mattered most. The days that followed demonstrated the true impact of Victor Reinhardt's actions. Allied forces, armed with the intelligence he had secured, pushed forward with unprecedented coordination. Strategic victories accumulated across multiple fronts, and operations that had once seemed uncertain now unfolded with precision and confidence. The enemy, still struggling to comprehend the sudden collapse of their carefully laid plans, was thrown into a defensive frenzy. Every battle, every maneuver, and every counterattack reflected the advantage Victor had provided. Troops moved with an awareness of enemy positions they could never have achieved without his insight. Artillery struck with exacting accuracy, ambushes were avoided, and critical supply lines remained secure. What could have been catastrophic failures were transformed into decisive victories, changing the trajectory of the war in ways that no single military leader could have accomplished alone.
Within enemy ranks, suspicion and paranoia spread rapidly. Officers questioned one another, loyalty was doubted, and the fear of betrayal became a constant shadow. Their strategies, once meticulous, now appeared haphazard, and their confidence was replaced by uncertainty. In trying to root out the cause, they investigated every possible angle, but Victor Reinhardt's careful planning and invisibility left them with nothing tangible to pursue. He was a ghost, untouchable and untethered from the chaos he had orchestrated from the shadows. Victor himself remained beyond reach, moving through cities and countryside with the ease of someone who had mastered invisibility. Yet he felt the strain of constant vigilance. The physical toll of the mission was immense, and the psychological burden even greater. Every decision carried consequences not only for himself, but for the countless lives that depended on the success of his mission. There was no margin for error, no room for hesitation. And then the culmination of those 24 hours became clear. The enemy's advance had been halted, their momentum shattered, and the Allies had gained a foothold that would prove pivotal in subsequent campaigns. What had been a desperate, precarious situation was now a turning point. Historians would later analyze the battles, the movements, and the outcomes, noting how a single day's intelligence had reshaped entire operations. But the individual responsible would remain invisible, his deeds known only to a select few within the highest levels of command. Victor, exhausted yet resolute, finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He understood the rarity of what had been accomplished. One man, operating alone, had influenced the lives of tens of thousands, if not more. He had acted not for recognition, not for reward, but because the situation demanded it. His courage and intellect had been the decisive factor in preventing disaster, yet the world would never know his name. As the war continued, the legacy of that 24-hour mission endured. It became a cornerstone for subsequent operations, a proof that information, strategy, and decisive action could achieve results impossible through brute force alone. Allied forces continued to advance, their movements guided by the advantage Victor had provided, while the enemy struggled to adapt to a battlefield forever changed.
Even decades later, analysts and historians would debate how the war might have unfolded differently without that critical day. They would speculate on the importance of intelligence in modern warfare, on the role of espionage in shifting the balance of power, and on how a single individual, hidden in plain sight, had altered the fate of nations. And yet, Victor Reinhardt's name would remain absent from public records, a silent testament to the profound influence one person can have when they operate in shadows, guided by skill, courage, and an unwavering sense of duty. In the weeks that followed, the ramifications of Victor Reinhardt's mission became increasingly apparent. Allied forces solidified their gains, using the intelligence he had provided to execute operations with unparalleled efficiency. Entire campaigns that might have resulted in staggering losses were now transformed into decisive victories. The enemy, disoriented and demoralized, struggled to recover from setbacks they could neither anticipate nor fully understand. Yet, amidst the chaos of war, Victor remained unseen. He was no hero in the eyes of the public, no figure to be commemorated in monuments or history books. His work existed in whispers, in classified reports, and in the quiet acknowledgments of a few high-ranking officers who understood, more than anyone, the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The war continued, battles raged, and nations trembled under the weight of conflict. But the pivotal moment, the turning point, had already passed, achieved in a single day by one man who walked among shadows. Victor's legacy was not measured in medals or fame, but in lives saved and wars averted. His actions demonstrated the profound power of intelligence, courage, and precision. A single decision made under extreme pressure had reshaped the trajectory of the war, proving that the tides of history could be altered not just by armies and weapons, but by the choices of a single determined individual. And so, Victor Reinhardt disappeared back into obscurity, leaving behind only the consequences of his daring and extraordinary deeds. History would remember the battles, the victories, and the generals, but the man who turned the tide in 24 hours would remain a ghost, his story whispered only in the corridors of command, a silent testament to the unseen heroes who shape the world from the shadows. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not performed on the battlefield, but in secrecy, where success is measured not